So good morning once again, and welcome back to the board meeting. I hope that you are ready for another very good discussion today. But before we start, I'd like to ask Ken to provide you some some useful information.
Thank you, Gabriela, and good morning to everyone again. Just so you know, we had some, and you will all of course have witnessed this yesterday. We had some technical issues with the sound, and some of us had difficulty accessing the internet. For some reason, there was some interaction with another large meeting downstairs, and therefore we had that sort of technical difficulty. The staff on site, the technicians who are sort of around, really pulled out all the stops after we finished our meeting today to wire the microphones. So you will see that essentially we have new microphones that are fully wired. And really my sincere appreciation to all of them, because I know they worked very hard, some of them overnight, really just to get our meeting up and running today. So with that, Gabriela, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ken, and my gratefulness to all the team that worked hard to provide us with a seamless sound conditions to work today. Thank you very much, much appreciated. So now we should move to the first topic in the agenda this morning after the panel, which is on the use of experts. 30 seconds, if you allow me, Laurie, just to say a few words about this project. This is the second, or one of the projects that we approved last December, and the importance of this project is this project is at least as relevant as the others that we are running for many reasons, but two reasons mainly. First, the topic of use of experts touches upon a number of other areas where we have been working lately, like technology, like tax planning, like sustainability. So it's really a cross-cutting issue that we are going to address. Secondly, without the use of experts project and the standards that will be developed, namely, and here specifically in the area of sustainability, the infrastructure, our infrastructure of standards would not be complete. You may have heard Jens earlier this morning mentioning the importance and the role of external experts in a number of areas. We have to make sure that once we have the standards for sustainability reporting and assurance ready, that we will also have these standards available for those in this space that who do not want to come to the first line, so to speak, of action, but stay in their experts area and will be intensively used, as we can suppose, by assurance providers and reporting preparers. So I just hope that the amazing meeting that we had yesterday and 2 days before, and the level of contribution and activity of and attention and focus of the boards is the same today, because the topic is really important, and we are now having the first discussions starting to conceive it. So, Laurie, without taking much more of your time, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Gabriela, and it's a pleasure to be here to provide our first update on the experts task force progress. I think before I start, I wanted to make a few opening comments, and then we'll dive right into things, and we really welcome your points of view on this. First, I'd like to make sure everybody knows who's on the experts task force. Obviously, Cam is working directly with us, and Ken is always guiding us, sometimes more heavily, sometimes less heavily, but always there with us. Sadia, Andy, Luigi, and Sanjeev, and myself have all been working together to bring this sort of first status update. And this is early days, so it's really a good time for us to hear your views before we get into the heavy drafting. I know it's a bit of a luxury for us, the way this is set up for us, and that we've got a lot of feedback opportunities coming up, including we were at the CAG last week. and that went very well, and we got some very good questions and feedback from that. We've got the roundtables coming up, the sustainability round tables coming up, led by that task force, but we do have experts, use of experts time built into those to get feedback from that extremely important group. So my goal today really is to listen. We're going to go through sort of where we are after our very first 3-day meeting that we had in early February. But the goal really is to listen and hear your feedback and thoughts so that at an early stage, we can really take those into account as we start to think about the structure of this principles-based framework that we're thinking about, and make sure that we get all this good feedback and utilize it at the appropriate time. Again, as I said, it's a bit of a luxury. One last comment at a very high level. This, Gabriella mentioned this is important task force, and I think that as I thought about it after Gabriella asked me to lead this task force, I do think it's very important. We expect that as the sustainability reporting rolls out and becomes more and more prevalent, the use of experts will rise at an equal level. So we are going to be confronted with more issues around use of experts and more potential ethical issues, which is why Gabriella mentioned that we want this ready to go at the same time the sustainability is. But I also think it's important because from a structural standpoint, it's important we get this right. We need to balance the ever-important public interest, and I ever mindful of the comment Robert made yesterday, which I think is so important around applying the public interest framework and really utilizing that as we work through proposals. But at the same time, understanding it will impact the experts pool that is available to us because they don't have the same compliance and standards that we have necessarily. So we will have an impact on that, and we need to think about those structural impacts that exist and how we develop that in a way that whatever we build, we don't create barriers, unnecessary barriers to the use of those experts out there. So I think there's a balancing act here that's very important that we need to be ever mindful of. So really, reasons for the project, obviously I mentioned the expected increasing use of experts, which from all accounts we're getting ready for. We heard that in the session we just had, someone mentioned that. I think that's true. I think there are increasing questions around the expectations, including ethics and also independence, which forms a part of ethics, of behavior for experts, especially in light of, I think, beliefs by most of us and by most of the people that I speak to, including the CAG last week, that experts get used because they're doing something important that accountants don't have the ability to do, different skill sets, an emerging variety of skill sets, some of which may have a significant impact on the ultimate assurance or audit decisions being made, and therefore it's very important. And as mentioned previously, this is progressing in tandem with the sustainability project for the reasons that we mentioned previously. We're going to talk a little bit about today as we go through this. What are experts and how they're used? This increasing use of experts is not just an issue of quantum, it's an issue of variety as well. And that's going to increase as more and more sustainability standards roll out in different areas. So we know that's coming. And I won't go into AI and ChatGPT other than to mention our task force did touch on that briefly because, it is something that's out there. And as mentioned, we don't consider that to be expert. It's more of a resource of pool of information right now, but something of interest out there. There is a public interest question, I think, about whether external experts should be independent. We're going to talk a lot about that today, and some views about how we might deal with that as a board in terms of promulgating a standard. And then how the code can respond to the changing environment. We're really thinking about a framework that is a principles-based type framework because this will touch so much. And within that, how do certain independence attributes apply in the context of objectivity? So before we go very far, though, we're going to go through a couple of basics. Our task force spent quite a bit of time hassling through the type of experts, and we thought it would be helpful if we had a little bit of a conversation around that. But I might pause here before we go further, and I'll try to pause throughout to see if anybody has any comments or questions. Maybe not at this.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Any comments or questions at this point?
Okay, very good.
No comments, no questions, Laurie.
So Cam is going to take us through a little bit about types of experts. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Laurie. So as Laurie just mentioned, the task force did go through, did review a high-level landscape review of the types of experts and the code of conducts or the code of ethics that are applicable to them. So what we've observed is that, for example, in the more established field, this can range from actuaries, engineers, fraud examiners, lawyers, tax advisors, etc. These often have code of ethics and conduct or codes of conduct governing their ethical behavior or their the standard of which they provide professional services. Generally, these code of ethics are they speak to the expectations of integrity, competence, definitely confidentiality, and also conflicts of interest. In respect of the detail of the code, as the IESBA code, though, there is a little bit of a difference. Experts in emerging fields, and we can see, for example, we've been talking about sustainability for the past couple of days, and also in emerging fields of technology, for example, the recent crypto-related accounting issues, these might not have as many, they might not have established professional bodies or generally accepted practices. And I think the point has been made also that sustainability, for example, would cover and need a broad range of experts in different areas, which again might will have differing expertise and competence levels, and also a code of ethics, whether or not it is applicable to them. So I'll pass it back to you right now, Laurie.
I think we're just going to see if there's
any questions.
Any questions or comments about the nature of experts, not that I expect that. So Cam is going to do one more primer for us, and that is around existing provisions in the code, because we have some very big sections, ISA 620, 500, and some bits in our code, but we've tried to boil this down into what we think we need to manage our discussion today without you all having to dig into that.
Thanks, Laurie. So in parts 2 and 3 of the code, in part 2 that's using the work of others, and in part 3 that's using the work of experts, there are 2 high-level principles for professional accountants to consider when they determine whether the use of others or experts is appropriate. And as you see in that gray box, just as a reminder, it's the reputation and expertise and resources available to the expert, and in part 2 of the others, and whether the expert is subject to the applicable professional and ethics standards. So these are the 2 broad overarching principles guiding this use. And additionally, for audit engagements, the ISAs, so ISA 620 specifically, and also in ISA 500s for the use of a management expert, they have additional specific guidance and requirements for the use of experts. So for an audit engagement where the auditor is using an expert, the auditor needs to evaluate whether the expert has the necessary competence, capabilities, and objectivities for the auditor's purpose. Specifically, this also includes making inquiries. So this, for example, financial interests, business relationships that might create a threat to the expert's objectivity. With respect to using a management's expert in an audit for audit evidence, there's also additional requirements to obtain further understanding of the work performed by that management expert and how that information prepared by that expert has been used by management. And further, I just want to highlight as well that in the code already, in Part 4, one of the upfront principles is that independence essentially is an extension and is linked directly to the principles of objectivity and integrity. So moving on, this is a good segue into the existing independence provisions in the code. So as recently just revised by the ETGA project, the independence provisions that apply to experts, so these would be internal experts. So for example, these would be individuals who are considered audit or assurance team members, and those are individuals who are within or engaged by the firm who can directly influence the outcome of the engagement. So for example, these could be individuals providing consultation on technical or industry-specific issues. They could also involve those who perform the audit or assurance procedures, and they might include individuals from either within network or non-network firm, but who can directly influence the outcome of the engagement. Explicitly, this also states that it excludes external experts. And so external experts, as defined by the code currently today, they're individuals or organizations outside of the firm who possess the skills, knowledge, and experience in a field other than accounting or auditing. So this is aligned with the IESBA, the direction of the IESBA, recognizing that external experts don't have the they're not subject to the same level of direction, supervision, and review as applied to audit or assurance team members. So I want to pause here. Laurie, back to you.
Yeah, I think one thing that to keep in mind as we start to move into what this framework might start to look and feel like is reminding ourselves that under ETGA, and we had long debates about this, which I think will play into and be relevant here. We took a very targeted and proportionate approach. Okay, so that language to me, and that's in the exposure draft actually that had come out in the final pronouncement. That targeted and proportionate approach is going to be very relevant as we now talk about how do we think about experts who today are not subject to independence, but where we know there are independence concerns as we use them more and more across a wider variety of topics. And I think as we move to the next slide, we're thinking about an enhanced ethical framework that will, and one more, yeah, will consider how experts will be used, the types of threats that exist when we use experts, and how to evaluate the experts, both competence as well as objectivity, which, as Cam has mentioned, is linked to independence. And I think from a principle standpoint, when we, as a task force, started thinking about how do we think about this, we talked for a while about that targeted and proportionate approach, because again, as I mentioned up front, what we do here has important structural implications, and finding that right balance is going to be important. The practical challenges of monitoring independence for experts who are external and do not have these types of systems in place, the potential for disproportionate costs or burdens, whether that is something that is a concern, and avoiding any other unintentional consequences. So we're looking at an enhanced ethical framework within, principles-based ethical framework within our code. And we started by starting to define for our code how we wanted to start to think about experts. There's a lot of definitions of experts out there, and Cam, I think you're going to talk a little bit about where we got to with that.
Thanks, Laurie. So on the slide here, you'll see some preliminary definitions that the task force is exploring. So we thought it would be helpful to introduce or bring into the code explicit definitions of what is an expert, what is expertise, and what is internal versus external experts. Now this is just to step back a little bit as well. Expertise, these are also defined in the IESBA. So in coming up with this, the task force has also ensured that from at least its preliminary perspective, it's aligned conceptually. So an expert, to keep it, taking it from a concise and sort of making it clear and usable in any context relevant. An expert is an individual or organization that possesses expertise in a particular field or area. And this expertise, then we can define it as skills, knowledge, or experience. We thought it important to also differentiate between internal or external, and that's, again, because of the increasing use of experts, and potentially also as sustainability reporting increases, the increased employment or engagement of employment of internal experts within either the firm or an employing organization. External expert obviously would be those engaged by such companies. And in the context of Part 4, then you'll see in the italics, there's a simplification of the extant definition in terms of an external expert is an expert that's engaged by the firm who possesses expertise in an area other than accounting or assurance. So this is a little bit of a change in the extant definition. This in the gray box there, you'll see that it's in a field other than accounting or auditing. So we've just broadened it to say accounting or assurance. Also highlighting what a external expert would be in the context of Part 4 for a management expert. And also just pausing here is that the task force is also what it will do also in due course, especially after the roundtables and as the sustainability discussions this week wrap up, is also further consider the definitions against the context of profession agnostic standards for sustainability assurance, because that might impact whether or not, for example, the use accounting is needed, but whether it's in the context of a Part 5 or whether in due course it will be an integrated approach. So the task force is well aware of this and will consider this in due course. And then on to the next slide. The task force also considered, okay, so we have these definitions to be introduced into the code, so that scopes what experts are. It can differentiate potentially what experts are in relation to the use of others who might not be experts, and then some example upfront explanatory material, application material can be introduced into the code to just explain or to highlight that experts can cover many fields, areas, and many types of expertise, from well-established fields, as mentioned earlier, to more emerging fields. And specifically for Part 4 of the code, as is currently, how to distinguish between expertise in accounting, which a professional accountant is let's say, supposed to have or expected to have, versus expertise, which is in a specialized area of accounting, for example, taxation law, which is more considered the legal expertise, even though tax is, for example, deferred accounting for deferred tax could be accounting expertise. Okay. And then the second layer, so those two slides just now introduce sort of the first layer of the enhanced ethical framework that Laurie just mentioned. So that's defining the scope and explaining what are experts. So then the second layer would be, okay, so when a professional accountant uses the work of an expert, what are some facts and circumstances that could create threats when they're used? So the task force came up with a few examples, as you'll see on the slides and also in the meeting materials. So these examples are included and defined under the 5 categories of threats, and explains how they create threats to the fundamental principles. So for example, if you have insufficient understanding of the expert's work, that's a threat, self-interest threat to competence, or if the professional accountant feels pressure to accept the expert's work due to time or cost spent on it, that's a threat to the that's an intimidation threat to the fundamental principles as well. And then onto the third layer, so that's the evaluation process that the professional accountant can go through when they use an expert. So when they identify, for example, why they need an expert, and typically that's because they need that specialized expertise for the work done. How should the right expert be identified? And so this would include what are the credentials of the expert, reputation, experience, etc. And then how will the expert be engaged and managed? So this is also very important. So what is the scoping of the expert's engagement, the oversight and controls? And I think earlier in the panel session, we also mentioned those charged with governance, their involvement is also very important. So what is the communication, appropriate communication with the levels of management and those charged with governance in relation to the use of an expert? And finally, the last leg of the evaluation process is how would a professional accountant evaluate the reliability of the expert's work? So there's a couple of factors that the task force came up with there as listed. So for example, consistency of the expert's work with other information, the reasonableness of the inputs, ability to understand the work, etc. So I'm gonna pause here and see if there's any questions. And Laurie, pass it back to you first.
Yeah, and maybe go put that last slide back up, because I think conceptually, before we started to move into what our flow chart is for decision-making, this is important. And a lot of what's highlighted on this slide relates to the two really big pieces. One, the competence piece of experts, and there are a lot of ethical considerations around that that we'll need to build in as we assess competence. And the other is the objectivity piece. And if you look in the second bucket with the purple top, a lot of the stuff around objectivity and independence falls into that space. And so those are the two really big pieces of things that we'll be building. One, ethics-wide, ethics concepts that would apply to everybody, and a lot of those relate to competence and objectivity. But two, things related specifically to objectivity, which include this concept of independence that is going to be a tricky one to navigate. So I want to pause there to see if this sort of thought process makes sense to people. And I see we've got a couple hands up, so maybe we'll start, Mark, if you want to kick us off.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. It sort of feels very much in the right space. The sort of won't quite say warm and fuzzy, but I think we're sort of going there. I think it's got all of the things that I'd expect to see. My one question is more of a sort of context thing. I was very pleased when you started off talking about the importance of a proportional approach to this. One of the things that I'm very aware of, and indeed some of the conversations that I've had with our hosts here in Abu Dhabi, that they talk about, what are you doing in the UK context where you're talking about trying to grow market resilience. So it's very much about expand the challenger share of the audit market. The big professional services firms quite often have the resources that they have their internal experts sitting within audit teams. If you're a smaller player in the market, you're potentially much more reliant on external experts to support individual engagements. And I don't think any of the things that you've proposed are impossible to do, but I just sort of propose that as something that might be useful to bear in mind as the task force takes forward its further consideration, because it is becoming an increasingly important issue, certainly for us, and it may be in other jurisdictions as well. But otherwise, it feels instinctively very right. Thank you.
Great, Mark, thank you. That's a great point. I'm looking down here. I think I see, is that Christelle? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I think it's really running in the good way. I have two different kind of question or observation. The first one, when on the slide where you present the difference between internal and external, I just wondered if it allows for enough clarity, given the various type of engagements you can have, which are more or less short-term, long-term, the closeliness of the relationship, etc. So there are diverse elements to take into consideration to put the expert in the right case. Is it internal or external? In substance and not just in contract. The other one was about the elements, the ethical elements that you have to clarify to have the right level of relationship with the right expert. And for example, on conflict of interest, etc., do you expect to stay at a general prescriptive level, or do you expect to discuss a little bit the means that a PA should use, or those charged with governance should use, to make sure there are no conflict of interest? Thank you.
So that's a great question. We did not land that answer in our first task force meeting, but we've certainly flagged for not just conflicts of interest, but anything you would want to learn about an expert, that we are going to have to land how we approach that. For instance, and we'll get to this as we go forward a little bit, but I think it quickly gets to the point that many experts, especially those coming online in the sustainability space, where they may not have industry-wide rules, et cetera, may have no, for instance, compliance systems in place around these types of things. And how do we get at that? You know, is it a confirmation? Is it a, so we are going to dig into that, Christelle. It's on the agenda, but I don't have the exact answer yet. And I'm happy if any other task force member wants to dive in and note that, but we've got that on the agenda. Thank you. And with regard to your other comment, absolutely right. And in fact, we heard something similar at the CAG. And also the delineation between internal and external, not just to the PA, but to the client, right? Because we know we have those at the client level as well. So it's, I think, a spot-on comment. Great. Vanya, I see you've jumped in.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, quite interesting. It's just much more a question of clarification, because we were discussing the material for the meeting and we realized that in the note for SWP, the project was first drafted as use of an external expert, and then external was slashed. We were in doubt if that mean that you want to become more generic, or if you have something against the external. Just to clarify, thank you.
Oh, no, sorry, that's probably just us using shorthand. This is because internal experts to the PA will be picked up under engagement team, et cetera, ETGA. This is geared toward external, and I think we just left that off, so good proofreading on us. But this is mainly geared, and obviously this objectivity, et cetera, for internal experts, they're already bound by the rules that exist. So we're trying to build something that deals with this whole bucket of people who have no rules, including in the objectivity and independence space necessarily. Okay, very helpful, thanks. Rich?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the presentation, Cam and Lori. And Lori, to your opening comments, I share that view that this is a very important project. If we could go to slide 13, and this is a little bit of a high-level question, but when we look at the external expert, and I'm sure there may be reasons that I'm not necessarily totally grasping, but particularly when we look at the definition for a management expert, but this could apply to the firms hiring them versus the management. I'm not sure I would follow that it should be only for areas other than accounting and assurance work. I do think management, can hire people that are outside experts to help them with accounting and assurance work. Particularly small and medium-sized firms, there are organizations that hold themselves out to do that. I also would suggest that we might want to think about that phrase, to prepare financial statements. I think it could be broader than that. It may be all related to that, but it could be much more indirect, like valuation of individual assets and things like that. And then maybe the bigger question is, and I'm not sure it's on this slide at all, but I presume that we are going to not just look at the person, but we're going to look at their employing organization, right? Because I do think that's a fairly significant objectivity issue. Thank you.
Rich, that's super helpful, and we'll take online your comments around the management experts. And yes, we definitely will be looking at the employing organization as well, because it's at both levels, obviously. Thank you. Anything else? Sunam?
Thank you, Rory. I think I have a follow-up question on definition of experts. Under the current IESB standards, I believe experts are grouped into auditors expert and management experts. The auditors experts then broken down into internal and external experts. So our proposal on the screen seems to be a little bit different. So my question is, I understand we have in discussions with IESB, then what alignment we are expecting? Thank you.
Yes, we'll work to align, and in fact, and I think without a doubt, we're using maybe a little more shorthand here for this meeting, but definitely auditor's expert, and then internal, external, management expert, internal and external will be part of our analysis in terms of the detail we have. So completely agree. We will not be out of alignment.
And then one more thing. We should have ambition. So on page, the four processes, can we go to the screen?
This
Yes,
one?
right. In terms of the access to the experts' working papers, I know we should be ambitious in producing these standards. But on the other hand, it would be really idealistic. But on the other hand, in practice, it will be very difficult to achieve. Yeah. So what do we think we need to have? I think we need to make an extra effort to convince experts are well aware of our standards, okay? And then they should accept or agree to our request for access to their working papers. So without the parallel efforts we make, it will be really just what something like language on the paper. That's my concern and comment. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a very good comment, Sugnam. And I think in addition to that, I think this issue of the potential impact we could have on the expert community if we don't build something that is applied correctly, and there's a disproportionate impact to experts' willingness to be able to work for accountants because we aren't focused on the right things or streamlined or able to deliver it in a way that is practical and usable. So I agree with your comment, and I think our task force agrees with that comment, and it's a concern to find that right balance, I think. Thank you. Anything else, Christelle? Did you have another comment?
Just on a follow-up from Sungnam, I think intellectual property and also business reasons might make it very difficult to depending on the level of access that you expect, because they might feel that it is a way to pump out their knowledge.
Thank you. Rania, do you want to jump in?
Thank you. So I really think this, really picks up all the major issues. My only question is, within these definitions that we have laid out, can we envisage a situation where the work of the expert, this external expert, really comprises the bulk of the work that is being done, the bulk of the evidence? And if so, how would that impact all of these, I mean, everything that you've put in there, be it the risks, be it how we evaluate? I mean, in that case, would it be enough for us in evaluating the reliability of the work to just be able to understand and explain? Would that put a requirement on us or the practitioner, the firm, to have an expert, an internal expert with the same kind of expertise to actually be able to evaluate? I think these are...
So look, it's a great question. One of the things that came up at the CAG is someone had mentioned, and you'll see when we get to more of the detail around the framework, someone had asked and mentioned that it's very likely in the use of experts that if you assume people use experts because it's an important area, it's very possible that a large number of experts as time goes on will have, I'm going to not use the word material because of the accounting context, but will have a significant impact on decision-making or the ultimate outcome of the assurance. That's what you're getting at, yes?
Exactly, which
Okay.
is when, like, because at the very beginning, the definition of external expert, it excludes someone who can actually weigh in or impact the outcome of the engagement. But
So-
in that case, I think, would that shift them to another category?
Yes, yeah, so you'll see, we'll sort of get into that thought process, and any expert where there's a significant or direct impact on the ultimate decision is obviously going to have to rise to a heightened standard, and we haven't defined that. We'll talk a little bit about that and get some detailed feedback, but I think you're going exactly where the task force went on this. And obviously experts that might be around a smaller, discrete, maybe important, but not as significant area, you know, we maybe don't have to have as significant of an impact. So thank you for that question. Okay, great. I think we had Ken or Galen. Oh, Galen. Sorry, I didn't see Galen.
Thank you, and this is an excellent introduction. I think it's sort of problem identification at this point.
Yeah.
I really agree with almost all the comments have been raised. To Sunam's point about access to confidential information or working papers, I have seen this in practice being a problem because in some areas things are deemed to be proprietary. It's almost sort of a black box. Here's my answer, but I'm not going to tell you how I got to the answer. The algorithms are protected, and there's good business reasons for that. They're valid. So that particular situation, I think, really does need some attention as to how the auditor would approach that. Are they going to just take the answer, or do they have to understand all of the underpinnings of how that answer was arrived at? In other words, the assumptions. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think, just to comment on that, I think that's very important. I think one of the things we're going to wrestle with as the task force is, because we're building an ethics standard, what is an ethics issue versus what is a quality control issue? And I think we need to come back on that point, Galen, though, because it is very important, and have, I think, a very discrete answer as to why it is or is not in the ethics part of the bill. Does that make sense for you? Okay, very good. Ken?
Thank you very much, Laurie. I think Sungnam and Rania have raised really great questions, and I really would encourage board members to weigh in as well, because those questions about, well, first of all, the interaction between how this board is going to approach the concept of experts, internal experts, external experts, and how the experts are being used in an assurance context, relative to how the IESBA has developed its own framework to approach the concept of experts, management experts, auditors experts, internal, external. So getting some clarity around this and how our approach is going to intersect with the IESBA's approach is going to be very important. And I would encourage the task force to really try to articulate this in a way that will be understandable by stakeholders, because inevitably the questions Sungnam has raised will be raised by many people, because it can get very complicated in a flash. if you see what I mean, because there's so many layers. Regarding the question of access to working papers, absolutely. I mean, Galen has again raised some important observations, and others as well. Rania, to your point as well. There will be some challenges, and I would encourage the task force to absolutely think about this issue of access to working papers and really understand the experts' workings from the ethical angle, because we can get tangled up with the evidential approach, which is more an assurance issue, and therefore should be dealt with by IESBA, or even a quality control or quality management issue again, which is more for the IESBA. But clearly there are certain ethical considerations for the professional accountant or the audit operations practitioner when it comes to making an evaluation of the expert's work. In terms of maybe it's it's inquiring mind, that level of skepticism, the concept of due care, and therefore how do we articulate this from a code perspective? What would we establish or put out there in terms of a reasonable an expectation of reasonable steps to be taken by the accountant or the firm in evaluating the work of the expert? So these are important questions, and I think we'll appreciate that if the PA is engaging an expert, we wouldn't expect the PA to be able to actually evaluate the work of the expert, because precisely the PA doesn't have the expertise to perform work in that area. But having an understanding of how the expert has approached their work, the assumptions they've made, are they able to explain their process perhaps, or are they able to explain the outputs in a way that can be understood by those who are going to be using the work of the expert? So all of these are important considerations that we need to put some structure around and be able to lay out in clear guidance for the PAs.
Thank you, Ken. I think that's a good point. And I think in particular, when we think about sustainability and the concept of greenwashing that's out there, that becomes particularly important, because we don't want, we want standards, and I think this is partly what Sungnam was getting at as well, that we want standards that ensure we're not turning a blind eye, that we're saying, oh, we couldn't get access, therefore, oh, we don't need it. We need to figure out a way to define this in a way and put some structure around it in terms of expectations that have an ethical lens through it, because we know, especially in the sustainability space, that's a very significant concern of stakeholders. Yeah. Okay. Felician, thank you.
Thank you, Laurie and the team. I think it's a wonderful presentation. I think when you read through the material, it looks very good and very convincing. My just one question is exactly what Ken has just mentioned, especially when you're looking at evaluating the competence of these experts when you're not an expert yourself. So when does it happen that you also say, as a professional accountant, maybe let me not take on this project or this assignment, because you probably know that you're not going to be able to evaluate the competence of this expert. And I'll just give an example. If you're looking at things to do with where you're saying cryptocurrency accounting, for instance, and majority of the peers will never have this knowledge. So in terms of ethics and independence and making sure that we take on assignments as peers, that they can be able to also go back and say with conscience that they have done a great job in terms of assessing this expert. I don't know, it's just I don't have an answer, but it's something that is very complicated in terms of how this thing is going to come out. But we maybe need to go deep and see how we can advise peers whenever they're taking on assignments to be sure that this is done appropriately, especially given the threats that you've indicated clearly in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Felician. And I think it's a great point. I don't have an answer either right now, but I think it's important, and I think at a minimum we have to develop some principles that will help people about how to think about that. And so we'll see where we get on that. We'll take that on board. Okay, very good. I don't see anybody else right now, so we're going to, we've got a couple of minutes before lunch, and we're going to start to dig into one more area, which I think hopefully will generate some important debate. We had a very good discussion in the space we're moving into at the CAG, and I very much welcome your thoughts on this, because this, for me, is the one of the most important and trickiest areas. So first, when we talk about what are key attributes needed from an expert, before I head into this area, when I think about it, I always try to pull myself back to a little bit of a true north of what is it that we need from an expert. We need competence, and we need objectivity. And we need to feel, because we have those two things, that we can rely on the work of the expert, okay? So we're going to get down into the weeds a little bit about a whole bunch of different concepts, but I want everybody to measure those against what do we need from an expert. We need to be able to rely on their work, okay? So now we're going to talk about some of the things that are very important as we think about that reliance. Objectivity, it's already been defined, is extremely important, objectivity and competence. As we talk about objectivity, we know that independence or independence attributes, and I'm going to use that word for a minute. I don't want to confuse people that I'm talking about, you know, full application of 4A to every expert, because that's not what we're talking about right now. But we're talking about objectivity and a state of independence of mind and appearance that may be relevant, and why that should be considered by an external expert. So I just want to pause here and make sure that makes sense. It took us a while to tease this out, because I think one of the questions posed to us is, should an external expert be independent? And in a way, you have to back up and say, why might you want an external expert to have independence? It's because we want them to be objective so that we can rely on their work, all right? So that's really why we have this slide in here. So then we get to the question, should independence guardrails, to be defined, be imposed, and this is the key question for us, should be imposed on experts? We know that ISA 620 requires us to evaluate an expert's objectivity, and ISA 620 has a very soft approach. It mentions you might want to think about whether they're independent with regard to certain attributes. All right, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail. It touches lightly on it, which is how we get to this project, because this project is really to talk more deeply about this and figure out more specifically what we might mean by that and give that guidance to people in the code. And so the guardrails may provide safeguards and strengthen the key attribute of objectivity for us. So I want to go to the next slide now, and this one is, I think, the one that should hopefully generate the most discussion. As a task force, we spent a lot of time thinking about the pros and cons of this, because it would be easy and a bit lazy for us to just say, yeah, experts should be independent. But then we will never get to the point where we get to the right balance. So we need to talk for a little bit, I think, as a group, about what the pros and cons of that are, so that we can then talk about, okay, how do we define the type of objectivity and potentially independence that might make the most sense in the case of external experts. And Rania, this then touches a little bit on the point you made, and are all experts the same, right, given the size or lesser size of the work that they do, okay? So as we went through this as a task force, these were the main ones. They might not be all of them, and you may see some things that are missing. Some of the pros of having independence guardrails is clearly the recent environment and the increased reliance on a wide range of experts. And I mentioned earlier, many of whom might not have ethical standards imposed. So this becomes actually a bigger issue for us. And the fact that stakeholders have heightened expectation of the objectivity issue. The public interest to me in this space is clear, arising from this increased reliance on the work of external experts. And then this concept of individuals other than external experts with direct influence on the outcome of the audit are scoped in for independence, and we're talking about ETGA, for example, even if they're external to the firm. So we've gone down this place already. The task force preliminary view is yes, and we have this on the slide. Yes, we think as a preliminary matter, we need to do something in this space. The question is what, and I think we'll attack that after lunch. Some of the cons, though, and these are equally important, and these will impact choices as to what we do. One of them, and I think it's very important, is we know that many experts do not have detailed quality systems, in particular in the space of independence. So then we need to think of, okay, so what would we do when we're dealing with experts that don't have what most firms have, which is, you're all reporting what stock ownership you have, et cetera, et cetera. So it's easier to get at that compliance issue. This next point, not under the direct supervision of the engagement partner. So a lot of the experts' work is in areas that we as PAs or the PAs in engagement leaders are relying on. The third point is this overly rigorous point. We have to find the balance. We don't want to do something that impedes the use of experts or the access to a stable pool of experts. And that has elements, and this came out in our CAG discussion, which are both geographic potentially, because there are certain geographies where there are very few experts available, as well as industry and certain complex, newly developing areas where there are very limited number of experts. And then just the cost and complexity. We want to get that right. We don't want it to be onerous. We don't want the cost and complexity of things to far outweigh the threat that is in place. So I'm going to pause here. I think when we get to Robert's point about public interest is very important. We know that this is paramount here, but we need to be able to articulate things and go through the public interest framework, help on this pros and cons if we've missed anything, because it's going to influence, I think, choices and recommendations down the line. So I don't know if anybody has comments in this particular space. Have we got these right? Are we missing things? Vanya and Mark and Felicia.
Thank you, Laura. Very, very interesting. About this possibility of range of experts, I would stick to the IESBA position about that, of being agnostic, because SASB is thematic. So we have different sectors. So the proper expert will depend on the sector or the characteristics of the firm. So I would leave it as principle-based as possible, because it might differ. So.
Very helpful. Thank you, Vanya. Mark?
Thank you. I'm very supportive of the preliminary view that the task force has put forward, and I agree with Vanya that the response needs to be something that exists at a principles level. I think it's not necessarily an easy question to answer, but the one thing I wouldn't like to see is something that basically said or equivalent. And it's that sort of, it's got to have sort of a mechanism that has sort of some meaningful teeth to allow the PA to carry out an assessment of, whether or not their external expert is independent, but not in a way that requires the building of new structures and obligations on professions that don't have them. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, and maybe one comment on that, and this came up in the CAG, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and Galen may remember this, exactly to your point, or imposes the burden on the PA to like have some massive compliance system for experts, because again, that would be an unintended consequence, right?
I absolutely agree with you, and I think, that in a sense that was my reference almost to a process that has some teeth, because it should allow the PA to satisfy themselves that they've got an independent expert. But in a sense, once they've satisfied themselves, as you say, without a glorified 45-page checklist and goodness knows what else, they're then ready to use that expert in support of their engagement, subject to normal oversight procedures in the conduct of the audit.
Yeah, fair enough, thank you. I saw one other. Felician, sorry, other side.
Thank you, Laurie. I think I also agree with the conclusions made. It's very key that the independence guardrails also extend to the external experts. I would even wonder why it was not the case before, because I think it's something that should have happened maybe earlier than this. Maybe my other comment is that if, in case there are challenges in terms of limiting the number of experts, like what you mentioned in some jurisdictions, is there a way there could be consultation with those charged with governance, just to ensure that certain aspects, they are aware of that, and then they can also give you a go-ahead to use that expert, just in case they don't want to hear that someone who is not very, very fully independent is being involved in the assignment, but at least they can give you that approval to use that expert in case there's that challenge.
Thank you for that. We'll take that on board and throw that into the mix of things we're considering. I think that's very helpful, Felician. Thanks. Chana?
Thanks, Laurie, and thanks for the presentation and the work the task force has done so far on this project. I would also agree with the task force's preliminary view that yes, we need to consider an approach and the guardrails needs to be extended, but it has to be proportionate to Mark's point as well. We don't want an elaborate system. I think, in certain instances, the work done by the expert would be material to the outcome of the engagement. And in those instances, then the independence consideration would become important and critical to the overall outcome of the engagement. So I think the task force has landed on the right place, and there needs to be some consideration on it. And I'd like to also touch on something Rich mentioned earlier about about the accounting part of it, the expert, and I think that is a historical thing, and we need to be more generic now, because sometimes, necessarily accountants don't have all the expertise you need. So sometimes it may be you are accessing another accountant who has that expertise, whether it's financial instruments or whatever it is. It could be accounting thing that you're accessing as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chana, very helpful. Vanya, is your tag up? Oh, no. Rich?
Yes, thank you. I am also supportive of the approach here, but maybe a couple, and I'm very supportive of both yours and Mark's comments about how one's going to think through this. It's almost the word scalability comes to mind a little bit. I do think there could be some situations where the nature of the expert and what you're having him do as the firm, if you're hiring him, may cause you to want to have more information about the degree of independence and objectivity. But I also think that we do need to also make sure we don't lose sight of considering the objectivity of experts that management uses for key things like valuations of significant assets or impairment assessments. And I think that is not going to be easy to do, but I do think we need to figure out how to properly scale that also. Thank you.
Great, I agree with that completely, Rich, and we used that example exactly. We haven't gotten to it yet, but I think you're spot on, and it's very tricky because some of those individuals or firms, as you pointed out earlier, can have longstanding relationships as well, and that becomes particularly challenging, I think, for us. Galen?
Thank you, Lori. And as I've been thinking about this ever since the CAG meeting, and it might get back through a few of the comments that were made earlier. On the firm side, obviously, experts internally have to be independent. So if you're approached by an individual and and it might be, to the view that was expressed about proportionality a little while ago, maybe you want to hire that person externally as a consultant. Should there be any differentiation in the independence? And I think the current rules would say no, they'd both have to be, it'd be a substance over form issue. In both situations, the individual should be independent, because you could just as easily hire the person internally or bring them on as a consultant externally. When you switch to the management side of this for an external expert, I think it gets even more complicated, because internally, to Rich's point, it's hard to determine objectivity, but since they're employed by the organization under the current standards, they're not independent. So then you would say, well, let's make that individual external. Well, if it's external, then the question becomes, well, who retains that person? And if they're retained by management, I think you get back to the same situation as if they were employed. So therefore, would you have kind of a regular, and I think Mark talks about regular or ethical arbitrage. Well, should the accounting firm retain that individual rather than management? And that gets you into this, are there unintended consequences, in other words, about how you structure who brings on board these experts? And I don't have the answer, but I certainly can raise the question.
I don't have the answer either, but I think that's definitely on deck for our next task force meeting, Galen. I think that's a really well-articulated point. Thank you. Okay, so actually, oh, you do want to do that? Oh, but we're here. Okay. I feel like it's a natural break, and I'd almost rather do the break and then come back. Okay.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and board members for the contributions. We will now break for a short period. It should be half an hour, but I would suggest 15 minutes would be okay.
Yeah, we can do.
Okay, 20 minutes. It's 20 minutes. Reconvening at 12:05, since we started a little bit late. So let's meet in 20 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. Sorry for being a little bit intrusive and putting myself between your coffees and the meeting, but we are running a little bit late. And as you know, we have a very exciting and important activity this afternoon. So, but also something very important to discuss after this break, which is the approach that the task force and the board should adopt with respect to assessing independence for external experts. The input of the board is going to be relevant for the board roundtables discussions. So I'm going to pass to Laurie, to present on the possible approaches.
Great, thank you very much, Gabriella. So we're going to dive right into this. I'm just going to bring us back from our last conversation where we talked about the pros and cons of some having some independence guardrails in place as part of the objectivity analysis. And we're now going to go into some preliminary thoughts around how we might do that. So again, a reminder, for all experts, we're going to have an enhanced ethical framework to identify, evaluate, and monitor the appropriateness of the use of an expert. But additionally, for external experts in particular, we know that we have concerns around independence guardrails. And so we're going to go into a couple of options that we considered and our recommended landing spot, and then a schematic for how that might play out, which we then have to build underneath that, the details, which we haven't done yet. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and Cam is going to go through, spend a little bit of time helping us understand what the task force spent a big chunk of our time talking about in terms of possible approaches, pros and cons, and where we landed in terms of what we think the right approach is. And we are very interested in your feedback on this because, of course, this then sends us off in the direction to build and draft. So this is a super important part of our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. So the task force considered 3 possible approaches to addressing or extending independence guardrails to external experts. So the first one, approach A, so that's a full compliance of, for example, for Part 4B for external experts. So the pros and cons considered, you could argue a pro is it's conceptually simpler. Everyone has the same independence requirements. However, there's a few cons, a few which Laurie mentioned earlier when considering whether or not independence could be extended. So for example, a disproportionate burden on the external expert, and the impact or the consequences of which might result in a limited pool of such experts, so a chilling effect. And this might be even more relevant for emerging fields, for example, in sustainability or in certain geographies. And then also the cost and complexity of monitoring the compliance with independence of the external experts versus the actual uplift in audit or assurance quality. The second approach that was considered by the task force was really taking a note out of the ETGA revisions. So that's the independence for individuals who are out of network but who are yet part of the audit team. So that's essentially Part 4A, but with a limited perimeter around what the independence for it. So the pros, again, this is already established. It's been debated. It's gone through. So conceptually simpler as well to apply. The cons, however, the task force noted that this approach is specifically for audit engagement, and but external experts could extend to broader than obviously audit engagements and also assurance engagements. And in particular, the task force also considered that it's the external experts' work which would influence the audit outcome rather than the individual. So that's the individual in a decision-making capacity who can directly influence the outcome of the audit engagement. And that's quite a distinction between the ETGA sort of definition for individuals who are scoped into the audit team definition versus not. And then approach C is an approach that the task force considered, okay, so what are some select potential independence requirements which could protect the objectivity of such external experts that are used. So this would mean introducing a differentiated and scalable framework for professional accountants when they use external experts in their engagements. The pros, I think it's scalable, it's focused, it's balanced, and it's already based on concepts which were considered in, again, ETGA, the project, ED feedback, etc. However, in the con aspect, it could potentially introduce a level of subjectivity. So what is, which external experts should be subject to these independence requirements? And I think this was discussed a little bit earlier. For example, Rania, you also raised the point in an earlier discussion. So Laurie, back to you.
Great. So now we're going to go to, when we think about this, we started to try to sketch out. You can go to the next slide, Kim. We started to sketch out what are we talking about, because this is a lot of words on the page, and we need to try to start to follow a decision tree so we can think about this. So the stuff on the left, we've already seen. All experts will identify, evaluate, and monitor appropriateness. Additionally, for the external expert used in other assurance engagements, the center box is critically important. we came up with a formulation, will the external experts' work significantly influence the outcome of the engagement? I will tell you at CAG, someone turned it around and said, we think it would be better to say, what is the likelihood the experts' work will significantly influence? But regardless of how we phrase that, this concept of significant influence being critically important in determining what direction we go. If the answer is it will not significantly influence, then no further action is needed. There's already been ethical work done on the front end that would be the same for all experts, and that's enough, okay? If it is a significant influence, then we want to ask the question, is it an assurance engagement? And again, this gets to the point that there will be external people, parties, stakeholders relying on this. And in order to rely, and again, I want to go back to my true north statement, why do we want objectivity, independence? Because people are going to be relying on it. And if it's a significant amount or issue in terms of the assurance engagement, that reliance will be greater. If the answer is no, then the idea is that no additional work would be done other than unless you had a reason to believe there were issues under the objectivity analysis. If the answer is it is an assurance engagement, the answer is yes, then we're going to move into the area of select independence requirements, which we have yet to define, but we're going to talk about that. Does this schematic make sense or raise issues with people? I mean, we took a long time getting at this, but it helps us then think about how do we continue on this path of trying to find balance and not overcomplicating the matter and having everybody subject to something where the threat might not be there or might not be significant, if that makes sense. Ronnie, I can see she's itching to ask a question.
Okay, so just forgive me, maybe my imagination is running wild here, but I'm just imagining a scenario where, let's say, a practitioner is issuing, conducting an assurance engagement on sustainability, where sustainability information comprises, both environment, social, governance, okay? And let's assume they're drawing on several experts, where every expert alone will not, change the direction of the engagement, but the three of them together. I'm sorry, maybe, again, I'm just thinking about this, thinking out loud. I'm just wondering, and perhaps, I'm just thinking out loud here, perhaps this is just fine, but what I'm thinking is, will the use of external experts in areas that we are not familiar with impose requirements on us to educate ourselves before we may engage with such experts? That's basically, so perhaps for the firm to look inwards and say, before we can actually engage those experts, we have our homework to do. My only concern is, and again, I don't know where sustainability assurance engagements are headed, but I think anything is possible the way things are going today. And if we want to look ahead, we have to consider a situation where we are drawing on, like a practitioner is drawing on very different fields. And perhaps because we are accountants here basically, and we're looking mostly from an accountant's point of view. So accountants, let's say, they have a report that includes sustainability information, but we basically come from an accounting background, and we're convening work, we're building an opinion based on evidential matter that has been largely gathered or collected by people other than ourselves.
So look, I think it's a great point, Ronnie. You shouldn't apologize for that. It makes sense to me. And in fact, someone asked me last week, to consider, in a way, the concept of, at that point, is there a risk the PA may be acting as sort of like a general contractor, right? And just, has this group of experts. I think we're going to have to get to that when we get into the guidance that we draft around how to evaluate the significant impact issue, significant influence issue. So I think it's a very good point, and I thank you for raising it. Thank you. Anybody else? I see Mark.
Thank you. So I really like the decision tree. I think it's really helpful. Just going back to the earlier point that you raised, Laurie, again about the proportionality and not wanting to create too much of an additional infrastructure. I wonder whether it might be helpful in looking at your decision tree to see to what extent you can align it with the requirement that already sits on the auditor in paragraph 8 of ISA 620, because that sets out the requirements on an auditor proposing to use an auditor's expert. And just in terms of sort of trying to streamline the process and showing consideration of both the audit-related issues and the ethics-related issues, that might help in sort of bringing it together in a way that is effective but not overly burdensome.
Yep. Yes, and we did discuss that as the task force. We haven't dove into that yet, Mark, but I think you'll see as we go a little further in some of the questions we raised for this group, delineate some of those issues that are out there. I think that's sort of where we're thinking. Galen?
Yeah, I like the slide too, sort of the way this flows, but I do have a question in the very first box where it says all experts. So, but aren't we just talking about firm external experts here as opposed to management external experts? Because if management external experts are selected and paid by management, why are we concerned with independence? We should be focused on their objectivity. I agree with that, but not independent. I don't understand how they could ever be independent.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be, and I think, oh, sorry, Galen, I think we haven't completely landed the thought process on that, Galen, but we had a big debate around the management experts. Obviously, the ones that are employed by the firm, I mean, that one's kind of an obvious answer. But when you get to the management experts that are external, some of them are, in some cases, are very specialized and highly skilled. And so we would still be looking at them if there was any instance where there was reliance or they would form a significant part, I think we'd want to understand at least things like, for instance, when I use independence, and I think we're using independence maybe in the wrong sense, how long have they worked for them? How many assignments? What is the size of that engagement? Things like that. So I think we have to drill down into what are things we might want to be thinking about where management experts might come into play that are external, that might fit in somehow into our work.
I totally agree with that, Lori, but I think at that point, you're really looking at objectivity, though, not independence, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yao Shu? Oh, sorry, Yao Shu.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. And my concern is that
Yao Shu, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
You still
I think
can't
that
hear me?
can you turn your
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'll send a message.
We can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Yao Shu.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Laurie. And my concern is about the significant influence the outcome of the engagement. And I think sometimes that for the materiality in the for the audit related, engagement is sometimes it's difficult to make the judge about the materiality. And for the sustainability engagement, I think is more difficult to tell how the significant to the outcome. And this is my concern. And sometimes in the practice, and the PAs, and sometimes it's very difficult for them to make the judge about about the significantly or the importance of the materiality about the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Yao Shu. I agree completely, and I think if we go back for a second to the pro-con schedule, that was the reference to we're introducing a level of subjectivity. If you go to the very far box at the right, this method does introduce a level of subjectivity and determination of what does that significant influence mean, and I think you're absolutely correct in spotting that. I think the challenge for the task force is going to be to think through how to build a principle-based framework to get at that. So we haven't done that yet. To TBD, we'll see how successful we are, but it is going to be a risk for us and something we're going to have to pay close attention to, I think. Okay. Anybody else? Yo, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Now, in my role of board member, not in my role of chair, I just have, of course, I like the way this is presented and the approach that is being taken. I'm just thinking about the presentation that will be made at roundtables and having in mind that we will have non-PAs, non-professional accountants, people from different backgrounds. Can you move to the where we were?
Oh, the scheme.
The tree. Yeah. Sorry.
The tree.
Thinking about presenting this to people who are not who are possibly not completely familiar with the code, even with the auditors and professional accountants activity. When you go from the question, will the external experts' work significantly influence the outcome of the engagement? And then you have no, so no further action, yes. And then the next question is it an assurance including audit engagement? And I don't know if it will be clear for everybody, and we will have people in the room who may want to opt between being a first-line provider or becoming an external expert. I don't know if it will be clear to everybody what we are leaving out. I mean, if it is an assurance and audit engagement, then we will make one of those decisions. What is out?
Yeah.
I don't know if I was clear.
I'm not sure I'm following. What do you mean, what is out?
So, is it an assurance including audit engagement? What could it be? What could it be that it is? Okay.
Yes. I mean, sorry. Yes.
That's the kind of I think clarification or examples. I don't know if it should be there, but at least in the presentation, make clear which services we are speaking about that would be scoped out from this this approach.
Very good. Very helpful. Okay. I think that's super helpful. Thank you. All right, and if you want to go to the next slide, Cam, is anybody else like, okay. Ken, were you going to?
Yeah, sorry, no, as I was just listening to what Gabriel was saying, and as I looked at the decision, or the tree as we call it, I just wonder if it would be simpler to in fact present two separate trees, one focusing on assurance and the other one focusing on non-assurance. And then we just deal for the non-assurance, it's only about objectivity, and for the assurance, only about experts. Because currently, I mean, on this diagram, it's combined.
Yep.
And
good
people
idea.
will raise questions. Yeah.
Okay, I like that very much. Thank you very much. Okay, that's all good. And Yao Shu, this significant influence, we did a slide on it. We haven't spent a lot of time on this, but this may help get to some of your ideas. This was really early on thinking about the types of things that might influence the PA's decision-making with regard to whether something is a significant influence. So nature and scope and intended use, the and by the way, there's a lot of definitional terms in here, like, okay, criticality of the work. What does the criticality of the work mean? But, you know, just as we thought through this at a very early stage, the complexity and subjectivity of the work, this goes to Sungnam's point, the degree of responsibility the external expert has over the inputs and assumptions and methodologies that are used. And I would add to that, given Sungnam's point, and how visible those are and available those are to the PA. So we have not spent a lot of time on this right now. This is something that this will be the next meeting of the task force, but I just wanted to make sure that you were all comfortable that we were thinking of things. And also, if you have other ideas or specifics, they're very welcome to us either now or at any time as we go forward. Okay? All right. Maybe we'll go to the next side. So now we get to, so again, this is another super preliminary thought process, but we started thinking about, okay, we're not talking about applying 4A, but we understand that there may be some guardrails that could be put in place that come from the independence literature as it exists. And so we didn't spend time on which ones make sense or don't make sense. We sort of wanted to put some things that illustrate the types of things that will be considered as we start to drill down on what makes sense. We welcome thoughts on this. Some of these are rather obvious, and if we go look at the external expert as individual, thinking about whether they have direct financial interest, loans, family members working at the client, personal family members or significant personal relationships, previous service, either with the client or as a director or officer or employee. And to Rich's point, we started actually thinking a little bit about if the external expert is an entity versus an individual. We just, this is a hard one for me to spend a lot of time on because we just didn't have time to get to it in the first meeting. But we just wanted to assure everybody that we've got this on the agenda. And if anybody has any initial thoughts now or things that look glaringly absent or wrong, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, you can rely on us at the next meeting to have some more input in this area. Okay. Mark?
Thank you. And it's only really to pick up on one of the issues that have been in our discussions on the sustainability groups, and that is sometimes with some of the providers, and it may be a similar thing for you with experts that are an entity, they belong in quite a complex framework. So we've got issues where you've got somebody, for instance, or a provider that sits in a private equity funded framework, and therefore it's not just the connection to the immediate parent, it's potentially the independence issues from all of the other things in the ownership chain, and it may just be worth also factoring into your considerations because we're wrestling with it a bit as well.
Yes, yes. All right, that's great. Anybody else on this particular slide? Okay, more to follow on this. I think this gets into the guts of what we might be able to do in this space and requires some very, I think, really disciplined thought. And then the last slide, I think this is the last slide, but I don't want to lie. Yeah, one more. So the last slide that was part of the task force deliberation was, look, there's probably some other things we really need to start to think about as well. Somebody's raised scalability. Mark, this was a group engagements, but the context of these complex type organizations, how long would the period of, and again, we're using independence, and I know there, some people in the room have said to me, you shouldn't really be using independence, this is really about objectivity, of which some independence attributes are part of that. But for shorthand purpose, what would the period of that timeline be when you have an external expert, right? How long would that independence, would those attributes apply? To Rich's point, individuals versus organizations, et cetera. So we know that there's a bunch of other things that are going to come into play as we start to get into the drafting that we haven't touched on yet. This is sort of a brainstorm list, so again, if anybody has comments today or wants to follow up at a future date, we understand that there's quite a few things that might touch on this that we're going to have to get into. All right. So, Galen?
On this slide, and I think it's a great slide to be thinking about these things, on the management external expert side of the world, would it be important to understand their methodology and why or how they contacted their expert, and what that relationship might be? I can see that the selection itself might be important as to whether the firm, the assurance firm selects the expert or whether management has.
Yeah, it's a great point, Galen, and I think we should add it. And you know, what struck me as you were saying that is, you know, the sort of the whole opinion shopping issue. Yeah, yeah. See, I read your mind. I'm getting to know you so well. But I think the issue is, you know, if you go looking for the type of expert that has a history of giving you the type of answer you want, is that a concern for us? Well, clearly it would be as stakeholders. And so that method, and that's just one thing in method of selection, but it's a very, very important one because certain experts obviously do, and you see this in litigation all the time, frankly. Experts get selected because, where's Andy when we need him? Andy's an expert. He doesn't do that, but he knows that there are people out there who get selected because they, you know, they have a particular position on things. Yeah. So we will add that to the list. I think that's a great point. All right. So oh, we've got another one. Vanya, sorry.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. And in the sense that Gail asked, I think that once sustainability information is out in the market itself will start creating opportunity to specialists.
Yeah.
And the market itself will elect criteria for the best specialists to be used under each sector or business or segment. So I think that we'll realize many changes in this sense. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the job that we are doing is so important, because these experts in the market will realize the utility of coming together with the code in order to have the seal of ethical that is necessary to grant the reliability of the information. I think that will depend.
Yeah, I think that's right over time, and I think the biggest risk is in the early days of, for instance, sustainability, where it takes time for that type of thing to converge, and the goalposts, so to speak, are moving, and so there's a lack of clarity or convergence in those areas during that time. Jens.
Just a brief remark, and it's mentioned many times today, but I want to highlight it again. It's a coordination with IESB, because I have made the experience that sometimes it's necessary to explain a little bit deeper why both boards have to deal with the same issue, but from a different perspective. And that was my experience in talking also to members of the IESB, to explain to them why we make it different or not different. I think this communication should start very early, and I would like to encourage you to do this as soon as possible, or probably is ongoing, because it's not just on terminology, it's also that the other side is understanding in which context. I will give you an example, the communication to those charged with governance, which is very important, but it's also a safeguard in our concept, and to explain that we have a say here because it's a safeguard, it's very important. This is the same, it's true, it's an equality issue and it is an independence issue. And to be coherent here, I think is very important. And that the other side, the other colleagues are understanding why we are digging there where they thought the deal is done. Thank you.
Very good, that's great. James?
Maybe just echoing your point, but going to Rania's observation about general contractor issue, And I think this is a placement of which standard setter addresses it or how we address it complementary with the IESB, because ISA 3000, and I haven't checked where ISA 5000 is, but there's a general concept that such engagements have always contemplated a use of multidisciplinary teams and experts where the practitioner's competence level is being leveraged through experts. They have a general provision where they discuss the extent to which the practitioner expressing the opinion has the ability to accept responsibility for the engagement. And that's when you're using multiple experts. And so there's a line of saying how much do you have to be involved with the work in order to meet the threshold, which is taking responsibility for the engagement. So that's a quality control element, it's a 3000 element, and if we want to bring that element in here as well, which is very valid in terms of our ethical position, I think it's just a matter of coordinating with the IESB on that.
Great, thank you. That's a really good articulation of that point, James. Appreciate that. Now I'm looking again to see if there's anybody else. Okay, very good. So one last thing, I'm going to speak very briefly to this, but I'm going to ask Galen to comment as well, since it was his meeting that we attended last week. I think we had a very good meeting with the CAG last week as the preliminary, obviously, first meeting for them to get a sense for what we were doing, and there was good, broad, general support for a principles-based ethical framework. We got a lot of comments and questions. I thought it was a very robust debate. And you know, also they highlighted the importance of coordination with the IESB as well. So we're hearing that message loud and clear. Really, I think the CAG did a good job of understanding the need to find a balance between the very important public interest implications and some of the practical application matters that are going to arise in the context of experts. As well as understanding and noting in particular the view that many experts' work products will be will have a significant impact, okay? And so that this issue of thinking about what the guardrails are going to look like is going to be important, but in particular the issue of, and this is to Yao Shu's question, the particular issue of providing guidance around what that phrase that we're using right now as a holding phrase, significant influence, is going to mean, is going to be particularly important. And then, which all of you have keyed on to today, is this issue of the role of the engagement partner and this general contractor concern, and how does this use of experts or multiple experts start to impact that. Galen, I don't know if you had any other comments. That was your meeting and you were able to listen, and I was sort of actively fielding questions.
I thought that the conversation today does echo a lot of what we heard at the CAG last week, that general contractor's notion. Wherever the board goes with this, I think it's going to be a challenge to be consistent, because we do have that divide between the firm side and management side, and where we can be consistent, we should eliminate ways to work around that that might occur by unscrupulous individuals. And I think the shopping for experts came up last week too. I think it's really important to try to keep in mind when we're dealing with experts, what else are they providing? Are they a major supplier? Is the client a major client that is wanting their particular views on something? And if that's the case, then I think it raises a lot of serious red flags. And I don't know that it's always going to be that we're thinking about independence. I think in most cases on the management side, we're going to be focused more on objectivity and competency.
ago. So I'm going to pause here if anybody has any additional comments. I wanted to ask Gabriella if she had any final comments, and then Robert, I know, was going to have a few things to say as well.
On my side, Laurie, nothing special except congratulate the task force for the excellent work done so far. I'm very pleased with what we are seeing here. You started from scratch not a long time ago, so the work done is impressive. But the clarity of the options and of the reasoning for each one of your proposals is also very welcome and allows a very straightforward discussion and a very clear conclusion about each one of the things. So I'm pleased with what I am seeing. Also mindful of the importance of this discussion at the future roundtables. Even if we are always tending to focus on sustainability, this is not of less relevance, lower relevance, not only because of its cross-cutting nature, but also because, again, on sustainability, I suspect that there can be some providers expecting to see what's happening, to make choices about which role they want to play in sustainability assurance, namely if they want to play as first-line providers or if they want to stay or move back to the experts area. So the consistency of this project and these proposals and how much they will complement the proposals on ethics standards for sustainability assurance, namely, is absolutely critical to make sure that the final joint product is consistent, has no gaps, and does not allow for any kind of arbitrage, like Mark mentioned, between the two areas. So nothing from my side. Very much looking forward to see how it goes in the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion today. Board members will have noted from the public interest issues list that was included with the agenda papers that the PIOB's been urging the board for some time to start this work, and now is clearly the right time to do it. So the responsiveness to start the project is very encouraging, as is the broad scope, which is challenging but necessary to encompass both preparation and assurance, and including, of course, the link with the sustainability project. So there are some pretty significant implications here in both the audit and assurance space for financial information, also non-financial information, but also in preparation. So it's good that you've taken that on, and although this broad scope will be challenging, especially in the emerging topics, it's a good project to be doing. Coordination with the sustainability project is clearly going to be important as you go forward, but that's clearly happening, which is good, and there's been reference to the need to keep the IESBA well informed and engaged with the project as well. That's good. The preliminary approach that seems to be going in the right direction, using the conceptual framework as the starting point to develop this differentiated, scalable approach. So the option C seems to be the right way to go, and it's encouraging to have, I think, to the task force to have the board's support for that today. So particularly important, I think, is working on the nature of the independence requirements that are needed, building on that very preliminary list which you had up on the screen just a few minutes ago. And then, as you noted, Laurie, the public interest framework can then guide the work as it proceeds, and as I commented yesterday, it'll be helpful and important to bring that out in the next set of papers that come back to the board, just to show how you've assessed the public interest responsiveness in applying this balanced approach. So I think you'll be able to do that specifically when landing on the types of guardrails that are needed and that are appropriate to include, and how that will be dealt with in relation to requirements and application material and such like. And that last list of other matters to consider, you'll doubtless do some further thinking on that, but that's fairly challenging, isn't it? So there's quite a lot of stuff to do there. There was the POB technical staff raised a particular point in relation to the internal versus external area. And so I thought I'd just mention that here, although Cam, you'll be aware of their concern about that. So for example, if an internal expert provides consultation for a matter that's not deemed significant to the outcome of the audit, will they or will they not be subject to independence requirements? And will the same assessment of significant influence be needed for internal experts? So that's the sort of thing which I'm sure you'll be working through. The outreach and the roundtables, very important, coordinating that with the sustainability outreach, which is good, and stressing that this is about public interest responsiveness, I think will be important. And Gabriella, you raised an important point about the need to ensure that there's careful communication with the people outside the profession as to why this is important and why it's being done. So I'm sure that will bear a lot of fruit. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing how the project develops. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Great points for us to think about. So I think that's going to end. Well, I should pause. Do any of the other task force members have anything they want to say? We have a great working team here who's obviously been instrumental in the development of all this. So I'll just pause for a second. No, nobody wants to talk. Okay. All right. All right. I want to say we ended a few minutes early, so thank you very much for all of your input. Super useful, and feel free emails, calls, whatever, if you have ideas or concerns, because we have a tight timeline, as we can see here. So we want to keep the information flow open and moving.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you to all the task force and the staff supporting this task force. This is very, very good job and very promising. And the fact that we finished before timeline that was set up and that we started late shows not that it was not substantive, but that it was straightforward. So thank you for that as well.